Welcome! In this episode, we're going to tackle the Pyramid of Doom, otherwise known as callback hell, with the aid of promises. Let me show you a Pyramid of Doom by consuming this node-style function a few times in succession. This function asynchronously adds the provided number to a randomly generated number. We want to call this function a few times and then add the result to each other. This is what's called a Pyramid of Doom. Although this might be a bit contrived, most people run into this issue on a daily basis as they try to interact with asynchronous functions like service calls and talking to DBs. Let's introduce some promises into the mix. I like using the queue package when doing this sort of stuff. I already have this package installed in my current folder, so if you're following along, you'll need to install it. Seeing that our function is a node-style function, we can use queue to generate a promise from it by calling denotify and passing in the function. We consume the promise by calling then on it, then expects a function that consumes the result. What a lot of people do when they work with promises, and I also did this for a long while, is still nest it when they want chains, as I'm doing here. But this still results in a Pyramid of Doom, doesn't it? So let's tackle that by using a promise chain. Let's remove this pyramid and start again with one call to the promise and one then attached to it. I chain a few thens onto it like this. In the last one, I add my desired end logic, which is to log the total to the console. For the ones in between, I just return a promise each time. See, when you return a promise from a then, you can chain another then onto it, which will be called with the resolved result of the promise. This is way more readable than the pyramid, and this is why everyone loves promises. Now, what if we wanted to work this way with a function that isn't a node-style function? Well, we can create a new promise function with a little bit of code. First, we create our function. In here, we create a new deferred using queue, which we can use to build up the behavior of our promise function. When doing this, you always want to return the promise from the deferred at the end of your function. Now let's make it do something. We call the add a random number function and we get the result. We call resolve on the deferred. Essentially, this is what calls back on our then callback function. There, we've got a promise chain that wraps an old school async function. Another nifty part of promises is the way it handles errors. To illustrate this, let's trigger an error if the number passed to the promise function is too big. In this case, we call reject on the deferred to trigger the error logic with this message. When we pass in a value that should trigger an error, nothing happens. That's because we need to add a .fail handler onto the end of the chain. This function gets called when any deferred is rejected anywhere in the chain. Pretty nifty. And that's the end of this episode. Promises are amazingly powerful and is also part of the ES6 spec. I wanted to show you how to do it without ES6 because you should be using it already. No need to pull in an ES6 transpiler or wait for browsers and Node to catch up. See you soon!